Hello everyone and a very good morning to all of you. Distinguished delegates, presenters and participants from SAARC member states and region around the world. It gives me a great pleasure to extend you all a very warm welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, I on behalf of Director SAARC Energy Center would like to thank you all for joining us in this video conference on possible uses of crop residue for energy generation instead of open burning. My name is Ehsanullah Marwat and I am working as Research Fellow Energy Efficiency at SAARC Energy Center, Islamabad. I shall be moderating today's session and with me I have Ms. Mehnaz Khurshid Gardezi. She is working as Communication Specialist at SAARC Energy Center and she will be co-moderating this video conference with me. Ladies and gentlemen, I am also extremely grateful to our elite panel of speakers from PwC for this session. We have Mr. Sandeep Kumar Mohante, Mr. Abhijit Lohakre, and Mr. Vinod Kumar Jain. I'll be introducing them before the start of their presentation. It is indeed our honor that Mr. Shoaib Ahmed, Deputy Director, SAARC Energy Center, is joining us today in this video conference. We are thankful to you, sir, for taking out time to attend this event. Now, I would like to request Deputy Director, SAARC Energy Center, to give the opening remarks. Over to you, sir.
Dear participants and presenters of the video conference, friends and colleagues, Assalamu alaikum and a very warm good morning. I, on behalf of Director SAARC Energy Center, welcome you all to this video conference to disseminate the contents and knowledge of a research study on possible uses of crop residue for energy generation. It's a great honor for me to open the discussion on this important environment issue for the betterment of the SAARC region and the health of its 2 billion people. Dear participants, the SAARC Energy Center is a regional institute on energy and technical arm for the SAARC Organization on Energy and Energy-related Environmental Matters. It's our endeavor to translate the energy vision of SAARC leadership into reality while taking care of any associated environmental issues. The center started its operations in year 2008. During last 12 years, the center has emerged as a vibrant and effective SAARC institute, which has played its role in all regional energy initiatives. Until now, the center has carried out 140 plus interventions. The reports of these interventions are available on center's website free of cost for all of you. Dear participants, rice and wheat are dominant crops in South Asian countries, mainly in Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and to some extent in Sri Lanka as well. These crops produce large quantities of residual straw and are mostly grown in rotation in same field time and again. Due to a very short window for the time between harvesting of one crop and the sowing of the next, the farmers generally prefer to burn residue in open air. Resultant black carbon emissions combined with dense winter fog give rise to atmospheric smog. Despite of some short-term advantages to the farmers, the adverse environmental and health impacts are much higher in magnitude. In order to counter these environmental and health impacts, the crop residue needs some suitable alternative usage instead of open burning. One possible solution is converting crop residue into useful energy, such as electricity generation by using crop residue as fuel in power generation facilities or production of synthesis gas from crop residue for the heating purposes. Dear participants, due to severe environmental concerns, it is important to thoroughly assess alternative ways and means of utilizing the crop residue. Therefore, in the year 2019, SARC Energy Center conducted a research study on this subject. After completion of the research, a workshop to disseminate the findings of the research report was scheduled this year in Pakistan. However, it's not possible to conduct the same due to ongoing pandemic. Therefore, this video conference is being organized to disseminate the research report. Dear participants, in this video conference, we have authors from PricewaterhouseCoopers of India who conducted the study. I am delighted to acknowledge the great cooperation and support extended by them. In the end, I once again thank you all for joining the video conference and shall request you to feel free in expressing your opinions and experiences and opinions. I would like to extend my special thanks to the presenters from the PricewaterhouseCoopers of India, Mr. Sandeep Kumar, and all those who contributed in this study. Lastly, I wish you all a very comfortable learning and knowledge sharing session in this video conference. With these words, I declare the session open. Now I request Ms. Mehnaz to take us through the agenda. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your kind words and wishes for comfortable learning and knowledge sharing session. Moving forward, we will be listening to 3 presenters followed by question and answer session. Participants will have the opportunity to ask questions, typing questions into the attendees pane of the main window of GoToWebinar software. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentations. We will be asking questions on your behalf. However, if you prefer asking the questions on your own, you will be given access to the camera share option. With this, I would like to introduce the very first presenter of today's video conference, Mr. Abhijit Lohakre. He is Associate Director, Power and Utilities at PwC India. Today, he will be presenting on overviews of agriculture sector, prevalent disposal methods, and technologies to generate energy from crop residue. Mr. Abhijit has over 25 years of professional experience. He has worked in power, energy, and industrial sectors. He is certified project management professional. He is also a certified energy manager from the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. In addition, he holds a master's degree in electrical power system. Mr. Abhijit has also worked in the field of project management, inspection, expediting, as well as capacity building. With this, I would like Mr. Abhijit to go ahead with his presentation. Over to you, Mr. Abhijit.
Mr. Abhijit, now we can hear. Hello? Mr. Abhijit, your mic is muted.
Thank you for the introduction. Welcome all of you, SARC Energy officials, delegates, and all participants in this webinar. So how we have structured, I will basically be taking all of you through this 3 aspects. One related with the overview of our agriculture sector, then what are the current prevalent disposal methods, and what technologies can be used for generating energy from the crop residue. And then thereafter, my colleague Sandeep will talk about the barriers, the recommendations, and implementation related aspects. Next slide, please. So giving a background about this particular issue, the SARC energy member states are basically the agro-based kind of countries where agriculture contributes to around over 20% of the GDP, and there are more than 60% of the population who is dependent upon agriculture. Now there are aspects related with the energy as well as to the agriculture. So if we look at from the agriculture perspective, there is an enormous amount of agriculture residue which gets produced every year. So the estimates are close to like 450 to 500 million tons of residues getting produced and then getting utilized, and over 80 to 85% of that getting burnt in the open. So which basically causes a lot of pollution related aspect. So that is on the agriculture side. If we talk about the electricity, the per capita energy consumption or electricity consumption in the SAARC countries is much lesser as compared to the developed countries, say the US, European Union or the others. Now in terms about the installed capacity, we have close to 400,000 megawatt of installed capacity in the SAARC nations, and we have more than 130 megawatts of renewable energy generation. Next slide. Here, if you can see, there are kind of pros and cons of crop residue burning. What happens whenever the farmers, they kind of take the harvest, and when there is a time to go for the sowing of the next crop, they have two options. One, to use the kind of a mechanized methods, or another is to kind of burn that. So each of them comes with its advantages, disadvantages. So crop burning for the farmers is the easiest option. The reason being that you don't require much of a manpower for doing it. Second thing, it burns the weeds and other kind of insects. Then third thing, it is kind of easy where you don't have to invest too much of money in doing that. But at the same time, disadvantages is that it impacts the kind of a nutritious value of the soil. And another, maybe the most disadvantageous thing is it produces carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and which are very much kind of health hazard to the people in the surrounding. So if you see in this figure, the burning in the field is the most prevalent method currently being used, followed by the other aspects like animal fodder or the compost or kind of throwing it out. In the year 2016, it's almost around 67 million tons of the crops they were burnt. And in the last few years, there is a much higher value of the crops residues they were burnt in the open field. Now let's see about what kind of health and environmental effects of crop burning that happens. So it normally is measured in terms of what are the values of the PM 2.5. So PM 2.5 stands for like particulate matter having a 2.5 micron as a size. In any country or globally, it's considered that below the value of 35 is something which is good for the human being, and any value above 35 is basically hazardous. So if you see in this chart, except Sri Lanka and Maldives, which are less than 35 this microgram per meter cube, while all other SAARC nations are above that value. It poses great kind of health related challenges. Now there could be two aspects. One would be in terms of the short term and another in terms of the long term. Short term aspects, as we know that it produces a lot of black carbon after burning of this crop residue. Long term aspects, there are a lot of kind of a greenhouse gases effect and which affects the humanity. If you see in the below figure, This PM 2.5 contribution comes maximum from India, the reason being because of the geographical size of the country and also in terms of what values of the CO2 are emitted from it. Next slide. Now let's look at the impact of crop residue burning on environment and health. One basic impact, especially in the cold winter months, is that when this crop residues they get burned, they produces a lot of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, the black carbon soot, and that gets mixed up with the fog and what we call it as a smog, which reduces the visibility. So we have seen that a lot of accidents happen during this particular months of winter when there is a crop residue burning happens. Air gets polluted to a very large extent and which impacts the human health. You must have read in the newspapers or must have seen on the television sets or heard on the radio that during this particular months of crop residue burning, the pollution level in the big cities goes to the alarmingly high level. In the last few years, the cities like Delhi, Lahore, they have gone to very high levels. Say, for example, in the last few years, the Delhi's particulate matter levels have reached more than 500, which is very, very high. Now, another impact of it is due to the greenhouse gases, as we know that it impacts and creates the rampant floods and the cyclone. Now, coming to what kind of impact this crop residue burning happens on the health, there could be some short-term symptoms and long-term one. The short-term symptoms, the people will kind of experience the itching eyes, nose, the coughing, then there will be a shortness of breath, breathlessness. So all such short-term aspects or the impacts happen due to this crop residue burning. When we talk about the long-term impacts, it could basically invite the lung cancer, it could be the cardiovascular related diseases, or it could be like respiratory illnesses, and there could be chronic allergies also. So in short, the crop residue burning is quite hazardous or dangerous for human beings. Next. Now, let's look at it from the perspective of how much is the rural population in the SAARC region and how much are the workforce related with the agriculture. So if you see in this particular graph, over 65% of the population in the SAARC region is in the rural areas, and almost up to 80% of the workforce is in the agriculture, which changes from 40 to 80% among the different kind of member states. Another interesting aspect, if we see within the SAARC countries, the landholding pattern is much lower. That is, for example, when we talk about the landholding pattern in Bangladesh, it is below 0.5 hectares. And similarly, it is below 1 hectare in Sri Lanka and Nepal and India. Pakistan, it is something close to 1.4 hectares. So this impact or the necessity of burning of the crop residue happens because of number of reasons. Those could be: one, there may not be the adequate infrastructure in handling it. Second, there could be the obstacles or there could be the constraint in storing it or transporting it, or absence of the mechanized equipment which are used for kind of removing those crop residues from the fields. Now let's see how this utilization of residue happens and the reasons for the burning. As we know, this farmers, what they do, they usually rely on the conventional ways for disposing the residues. So what are the typical conventional ways? It could be for the animal food, or it could be the fertilizers, or it could be used for cooking, compost, mulching. So these are the normal standard ways which normally the farmers will look at it. Now, why this particular constraint arises? There is a very short window. Once the farmers are harvesting the crop, from harvesting the crop till sowing of the next crop, there is a very small window of something like 3 weeks or 20 days is available. So they need to clear off their fields and kind of sow the next crop. So they find it economically viable to burn the crop residues. The reason is the reasons are twofold. One, it requires very less manpower. Second, it requires very less amount of money because hardly any money is required for burning it. Other thing is that the equipment, mechanized equipment which are required for removing this crop residues, those are rented at very high rates. So say for example, in case of India, the machines for removing this residue, they will charge something like 1,000 per hour. So which are very high. The normal average farmer won't be able to afford it. So they always find it easy that burning is the kind of a cheapest disposal method for the crop residue. Next slide. Now, if we talk about what are the current disposal methods of crop residue, so as I mentioned, burning is the most prevalent. Other than that, how the farmers are kind of disposing of the crop residue? One, it is a cattle fodder. So whatever are the useful stuff from the crop residue, they use it as a cattle fodder. Another one which is kind of prevalent across the SAARC nations is a biogas production or as a use as a cooking fuel or thatching of the roofs. So this is quite prevalent among all the SAARC nation countries. Another one application is kind of preparing the compost. So it is used as a fertilizer. This is also very prevalent across all SAARC member countries. Then another application is on the heating side. Heating, so where it is burnt in the brick ovens and the kilns, or for the domestic heating purposes, where the crop residue is used to produce the heat. This is again a kind of a common application or a disposal method. Then another method which has picked up in the last few years is selling it for the power generation. So there are now kind of a waste biomass based plant which require such fuel on an annual basis. So the farmers tie up through the agencies with such plants and then they are sold to such power plant manufacturers generators. And the last but not the least, what we are discussing about is burning in the open field, and which is maybe 80-85% of the total residues. Next slide. Now, which are the potential crops for energy generation in the SAARC member countries? So, if we look at the kind of a cropping pattern, we will find that the cereals like rice, wheat, maize, they have the highest residue producing potential once when we compare it with like pulses, oilseeds, cotton and jute. Now the common thing what you will find among the SAARC nations that rice, wheat and maize, they are grown across the SAARC member countries. So the potential of crop residue is highest among these crops. So we can always think of using the residues from this rice, wheat and maize for electricity. Now, how do we look at the potential crop for the energy generation? Some of the aspects we need to consider, that how much area is under cultivation, what is a kind of a annual production of a crop, what is the estimated residue from it, and what is the energy content of it. When we talk about the energy content, it needs to be a kind of a calorific value, and another is a moisture content. See, when the moisture content is high or the calorific value is low, then by burning it or by kind of utilizing for the energy generation or electricity generation will be much lower compared to when you have a higher calorific value waste and having a lower humidity or moisture content. Next slide, please. Now, here is a kind of figures for the crop residue potential. So if you look at these numbers, you will find that the highest potential for energy generation, it can be realized in these three member countries, that is India, Bangladesh and Pakistan. So the second column, it is basically the kind of how much is a gross residue production in million tons. So you will see this value something close to 450 million tons. So it means that on an annual basis, in the SARC member countries, close to 450 to 500 million tons of crop residue are produced. Then what is a surplus residue production? Surplus residue production is the value out of this after utilizing it for other purposes like cattle, fodder. Then we talked about the compost, we talked about selling it to the power plants. So what is left is something like 140. Now, if there is no option for the farmer to utilize this surplus residue production, then he will have no option but to burn in the fields. Next slide, please. So it is important to look at how the supply chain for the crop residue happens, because that will help in understanding how efficient or how feasible is the energy or the electricity production from the crop residues. Now there are sources, that is the fields or the places from where we get the agriculture waste in the form of crop residue. So those are kind of collected once the crops are harvested. Those need to be kind of a pre-treated. Now, why pre-treatment is required? As I mentioned, there is a lot of humidity or the moisture content in the crop residue, and which is not really useful for burning or producing of electricity. So there need to be pre-treated. It needs to be dried, and then it needs to be stored. After storing, it has to be transported to the places where it can be used. It could be like a waste-based power plant, or it could be, say, the gasifiers, where it can be used in that. And then from that, the power and heat could be produced. So in this process, if you see from kind of a collecting till it is kind of a getting burnt inside the boiler or a gasifier to produce the electricity or the heat, the number of steps are involved in that. So it is important to understand this kind of a supply chain and to have efficient and robust mechanism for dealing with it. Next slide, please. Typically what happens when the crop residues are available, those are available in the large volumes, and it can't be really be used in its current condition. The reason, one, it's a kind of a voluminous thing. So there will be large transportation cost involved in that. So typical transportation cost is something like 7 to 10 US dollars on a per ton basis. How the transportation happens? It happens through the tractors, trailers, trucks, and then rarely through the railway routes also. Then this crop residue, the other option is to kind of producing the pellets and the briquettes. So you may be aware that the pellets and briquettes are nothing but kind of a compressing of this residue into the smaller volumes. So it could be either the blocks or it could be the small size items. So when we talk about the pellets, it's basically process of molding or compressing residue into the shape of a pellet. And when we say briquette, it's basically compressing block of biomass material for firing in the combustion. So here what happens, the pressure is applied to the crop residue and then either the bricks or the pellets, that is the small cylindrical kind of crop residue, those are produced. And then it becomes easy for the transportation and also it becomes easy for the burning inside the boilers or inside the gasifiers. Now, there are kind of a weather effect on the residue before utilization. So once residue, crop residue is taken out from the crops, as I mentioned, it needs to be dried, then to be converted into pellets, briquettes, and then to be used in the gasifier or the boilers. In the meantime, if it is stored, there is a high possibility that there might be a ingress of the moisture. So one, we require kind of storage facilities for it so that the moisture doesn't impact it, or we need to have the facilities close to the fields where it can be used. Next slide, please. There are now we talk about, now we'll see what are the kind of alternative uses of the crop residue other than what we discussed. So one is related with the fertilizer making, composting. So the crop residues, when they are available, those can be used in the compost pits and then it can be used as a manure fertilizer. Another option is kind of a mushroom cultivation. So it has also picked up in the last few years where the residues from the rice and wheat are used in the mushroom production, typically in the tropical areas. Another use in the paper and pulp manufacturing. So especially the crops residues which are kind of a rich in fiber, like that of rice, wheat, sugarcane, and cotton, they are used in the paper and pulp manufacturing industry. Now, coming to the important part of our discussion, that now what kind of technologies can be used for the energy generation? So, when we talk about the technologies, basically 5 different technologies are used. One is a combustion, another is a gasification, third is a pyrolysis, fourth is a anaerobic digestion, and fifth is a co-firing. So let's go one by one into each of these technologies. The first one is a combustion. When we talk about the combustion, it's like burning in a kind of a controlled environment. So when we talk about the combustion, it could be the combustion inside the boilers. So as I mentioned earlier, the moisture content of the crop residues could be very high. It could be up to the 60%. So one of the efficient way of utilizing it in the boilers is converting into pellets or briquettes and then firing it in the automated pellet boilers. So by virtue of firing such pellets in the boiler, we can produce the electricity. So we can produce the electricity even beyond 5 megawatts of capacity. So this is a very proven kind of a technology where we are using the crop residues, utilizing the combustion technology in the boilers. Here, if you look at the installation cost, it is close to 1 million USD on a megawatt basis. And then this is a tariff close to 0.134 to 0.14 per unit. The next one is gasification. As the word suggests, it's basically producing a gas from the biomass. So it's basically a thermochemical process where the solid biomass, it produces combustible mixture of gases, what we call it as a producer gas. So this producer gas comprises of carbon monoxide, hydrogen and methane, and those gases can be used to fire the engines. So the gas engines could be fired using this producer gases. This producer gas is cleaner as compared to the normal flue gases. So it can be used quite efficiently in the gas engines. Now the application is that it can be used in the small capacities, in the kilowatt capacities in the rural areas, and this is currently being used across the member states. Now when we talk about the installation cost, it is something like 0.63 to 0.85 million USD per megawatt and 0.12 to 0.13 per unit as a tariff. So if you compare gasification cost, installation cost vis-a-vis combustion, it is much lower. Moving to the next one, pyrolysis. Now pyrolysis is a little different than the earlier two. The reason is that it's basically a thermal decomposition in a very high temperatures and which happens in the absence of oxygen. So this pyrolysis technology, I will say it's more in the kind of pilot stages or R&D stages, and it is not really as prevalent as that of gasification. Though it's a kind of a low cost technology as compared to a combustion, it is little complex. When we'll go to the next slide, we can see that. It is quite similar to the gasification. Here also, what is happening? The gases are getting produced and which are being used for running of again the kind of gas engines. If we look at the installation cost, I'll say it is comparable to kind of the earlier two technologies. Now the next two, one is regarding the anaerobic digestion and the co-firing. So anaerobic digestion, we know it is the process of producing the methane-rich biogas, which is in the absence of oxygen. And this is quite prevalent in the SAARC countries. So it is typically used for the small size rural and the off-grid applications. And it produces the biogas. Then the co-firing is an interesting thing. So co-firing is like firing the normal coal-fired boilers along with the biomass. So up to certain extent, say up to 15 or 20% of the total volume or the value of the fuel can be replaced by biomass for production of electricity. So if you look at the installation cost, it is much lower, which is 0.42 to 0.5 million USD per megawatt. Now moving on, how do we kind of select a technology? So you will find here in this format or the table, the anaerobic digestion is being used across the SAARC countries. Combustion is also prevalent across the SAARC countries. Co-firing, there are regulations at this point of time only in India that where it is kind of allowed to co-fire the biomass along with the coal. Then if you see the gasification, it is being used in Bangladesh, India, Nepal and Pakistan. Pyrolysis, as I mentioned, this is not yet picked up to that extent, but still there are kind of a pilot plants or the small capacity plants in India and Pakistan. Now, if you see this in terms of the implementation as well as in terms of how easy it is, then you will find that anaerobic digestion, co-firing and gasification are something which can always be thought of. Combustion, it's basically cost of implementation is high, while in case of pyrolysis, the cost as well as the difficulty is on a higher side. So what is recommended? It is recommended to have installed the gasifiers in the countries to the extent possible because it's a low cost, easy implementation and scalability from few hundreds to the few megawatts. Moving on. Now, how the gasification process happens. So the syngas, or what is called as a synthetic gas, it, it gets produced through this gasification process, and that can be used in the internal combustion engines. So that can produce the electricity. What happens? The biomass gets broken into kind of a carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and methane. And then there are kind of end products like ash, slag, char, oil, etc. Now, gasification, uh, it's basically, as I mentioned, the syngas is getting produced. So there is a difference between a syngas and what we call it as the earlier gas, what we saw in the process. So in case of a syngas, the non-combustible gases also kind of are removed. So it becomes really efficient. So the process is there is a drying of a biomass, then pyrolysis, it is getting heated at a high temperatures above 300 degrees centigrade, and which produces the char, and then char itself is getting burned in the air or oxygen, and it helps in the further reaction. So what happens then? There is a kind of a reduction reaction, and it produces the synthetic gas, and then the synthetic gas is used in the gas engines. Moving on. Now let's look at what kind of gasifier technologies are available. There are basically on a broad level, we can say that updraft, downdraft, crossdraft, fluidized bed, and intent flow technologies are available on the gasifier. Now, when we talk about the first three, updraft, downdraft, and crossdraft, that basically relates to where the air flows from. Updraft, the air is flowing in the upward direction. Downdraft, where air is flowing in the downward direction, and crossdraft, where air flows in the cross path, and then fuel comes from the top. So depending upon how the air is taken into the gasifier, these gasifier types are devised. Now fluidized bed. So the fluidized bed basically gasifier where there is a bed of a inert material. So what happens when this fuel gets burnt inside the gasifier? There is a complete combustion. It happens because of the layer of a inert bed. Now in case of a entrain flow gasifiers, the fuel and air are introduced from the top reactor. So in this particular cases, the temperature ranges are very high, and then the gas produced is used for electricity generation. Moving on. Now, if we compare about what are the advantages and disadvantages, the updraft is the most simple design among all gasifiers. But the disadvantage is there is a high amount of tar which gets produced and can be taken out from the bottom of the gasifier. Advantage of downdraft, the clean gas is produced compared to the updraft one. But at the same time, disadvantage is there is a high amount of ash and dust produced in that. In case of crossdraft, gas cleaning requirements are low, but again disadvantage is high amount of char. While in case of fluidized bed, there is no issue related with the clinker formation. Clinkers are like maybe kind of a solid material which gets produced in the combustion while kind of burning. The disadvantages, There could be a gas stream contaminated with the fine dust particles. Now, when we talk about the entrained flow, the advantage is short residence time of a biomass where it gets kind of a burnt quickly. The disadvantage is there are very high temperatures which causes material handling and ash melting related issues. Moving on. Now we have come to the last slide of this particular section. Now, what are the kind of advantages of biomass gasification? This is a very flexible operation. You will find that there are different types available. It can suit from the smaller capacities in kilowatt sizes up to megawatt capacity as well. Another kind of advantage, it's a very mature technology. It has been used since years and this has been proven. And then there are different designs and capacities available to suit the requirement for each of the country or each of the type of the fuel also. Power generation, now it can produce the power, so it can be a like a off-grid application. So if there are crop resistance,
Mike to common.
so if there, it helps in the kind of a power generation. Then economic viability, it's quite economical to use this gasifier technology. Then helps in kind of a mitigating the climate change related aspects. It is also having a socio-economic benefit. It can be used to generate the local employment and the capacity building, because once the gasifiers get installed, you will require kind of the manpower to feed the biomass or maybe a crop residue into that, also will be required for kind of a monitoring how the gasifier is performed. So this is in short about the advantages of biomass gasifications. So to conclude, as far as the technology is concerned, there are kind of a prevalent 5 technologies, and the biomass gasifier is something which the SAARC countries need to think of kind of implementing on a large scale basis. So now I will take a pause and kind of wait for any queries or the questions, comments regarding this particular section.
Thank you, Abhijit, for your excellent presentation. Abhijit, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm able to hear.
That's great. That's great. Now we will move to the question and answer session on your part of presentation. We will give access to as many participants as possible to ask question within the time allocated for this session. For those who wants to come online, may share their camera while asking the question. So for first question, I'll request Deputy Director SAARC Energy Center, Dr. Shoaib Ahmed. Please, sir.
Hello, Rich. Thank you very much. It was a very nice, very informative session by you. My question is that you mentioned that apart from the energy solutions, there is a compost and the fertilizer is also one of the solutions. I find that very useful because it's a direct benefit to the farmer. But to my knowledge, it takes a bit more time. So my question to you is that while carrying out this study, did you come across any, let's say, any technology which can reduce the time for making the compost or the fertilizer, so that if the farmer can get the benefit within, let's say, 10, 15, 20 days, so maybe he takes it as a one of the takes it as first option. So any comments from your side, please?
Yeah. So thanks for your question, sir. We looked at the what kind of technologies are available for kind of maybe expediting that compost manufacturing. What we understand that it is still in the kind of R&D stages, and there are quite a few research institutes they are working on having the expedited impact or producing the compost, but to answer it, at this point of time, it's not really available on a commercial basis. So I hope maybe going forward, we can have the technology which can definitely help the farmers in producing the compost in a shorter period of time. But at the same time, this compost or manufacturing, there are two aspects related with it. One is kind of a land requirement, the pit where they need to kind of produce the compost. And the second one is not all crop residues they may want to convert into that because that might be too excessive for them. So in any case, they need to kind of think about the excess one other than the compost one, how to kind of dispose of.
I have another question from it is from Bhutan. For collection till production of power from these crop residue, there are number of steps required. As such, is it economical to produce energy from those? And if not economical, how can the government address these issues?
I will kind of comment on part of it, and then I will request my colleague Sandeep also to address it. One, this collecting the crop residue and then bringing it to nearest kind of a waste-based power plant. There are a lot of steps involved in that, and then there are a lot of intermediaries also in that. So one, there is a quite bit of a time from the time the crop residues are collected and kind of used in the waste-based power plants. The second aspect is if we use it in the gasifiers closer to the fields or the places where the crop residues are getting produced, then this transportation related element could be avoided. So I'll request the other panelists also maybe to kind of a comment on that.
Thank you very much. Well, I would like to welcome Mr. Sankar Narayan from Mumbai. He is with us for a live question. So over to you, Mr. Sankar Narayan.
Yeah, Mr. Abhijit.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, see, I have gone through this report. We got all the technology and the crops available at different countries. For each technology, what will be the break-even cost for the cost of residue? If the cost escalation is there, how to protect the capital investment?
Yeah. So, sir, that aspects are getting covered in the second part of this presentation. So, maybe I'll request.
Second part, we have seen lot of case studies, but basically we can have one matrix. If suppose the current level of cost residue of the cost and each technology which will be viable, if it is going beyond certain limit, how the capital has to be protected if we are putting on a power plant.
Yeah, this is Sandeep Mohanty. I'm a colleague of Abhijit, and the next part of the presentation, sir, which I will be taking up, we will specifically cover the commercial point, but let me throw a little bit of light onto this overall crop residue based power generation, and which has a relevance to your question as well as the question before this. So you're right. I mean, let's also assume that this is a tough technology to implement. This is also an expensive technology to implement. So it's not as cheap as with renewable, with solar or wind prices. If we compare the kind of range that we are looking at, 3 cents a unit, it's not something that this technology will provide you. It's not a cost-centric technology. However, wherever when we look at technologies such as this, or let's say waste management technologies, we should never look at it from an isolation of power sector alone. We should look at it from an economic value add to the country, because there are benefits to so for example, how do we monitor the alternate source of crop disposal, right? Crop residue disposal would have been either burning or some other way. Now that creates it's an environmental issue. It creates health hazard, and what is the cost implication to that. That should also be part when we are looking at benefit estimation from a national level. So in most cases, you would see that these are subsidized technologies where they are provided certain advantages either in form of direct subsidy or a must-run status or a must-buy status by distribution companies. Because essentially, if you compare with the size of these plants, these are minuscule compared to the overall procurement of a distribution company. So this can be, for example, as you know, in Maharashtra, right? So we used to have at least a mandatory purchase obligation for the gas, because while it's an expensive technology, it does. I mean, it has an environmental and overall economic benefit for the state as a whole. So to that extent, the idea is that if we look at it from an isolation perspective, the summary is this: that if I look at from an isolation perspective, the prices may not appear to be as lucrative as some of the other RE technology. But if we look at it from a much more holistic perspective, considering the alternate cost that it will have on environment, on health, and security, to that extent, if we include those costs in our estimation, then from a national or from a state perspective, it will appear to be something which should be adopted. How do I mitigate the hike? How do I still mitigate the cost element? There are two ways. Either I can look at direct subsidy, although most countries are doing away with direct subsidy because it has pain on the overall balance sheet of the government. So the alternative, what we can look at is softer measures. For example, mandatory purchases. For example, giving FIT tariffs, etc., which can make it a viable technology. I hope prima facie it answers your question, but we'll cover the numbers, pure number part of it in subsequent presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Abhijit.
Thank you, Sandeep.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, especially Sandeep, for your intervention and supporting the question with Mr. Abhijit. Well, we have a few more questions, like one is from Mr. Yash Khanna and Mr. Tularam and few other questions. But I believe the way you explained, and I expect that those questions would be obviously answered in our next presentation. Otherwise, I will take these questions in the end of your presentation, Sandeep. So with this, I end this session. Thank you very much, Mr. Abhijit, for taking us through the overview of agriculture sector, prevailing disposal methods and technologies to generate energy from crop residue. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Moving forward, now I would like to introduce the second presenter of the day, Mr. Sandeep Kumar Mohante. He is Director, Power and Utilities at PwC India. Today he will be presenting on energy generation potential for member states, its barriers and challenges for implementation and recommendations. Mr. Sandeep has over 10 years of experience in management consulting. He has expertise on various sectors such as power and utilities, mining, urban transport, and agriculture. He has worked on multiple engagements in countries. He has been supporting various funds in creating opportunities in South region and setting up operations in respective countries. He holds a master's degree in business management with specialization in finance and strategy. So with this, I would like to request Mr. Sandeep to proceed with his presentation. Over to you, Mr. Sandeep.
Thank you, ma'am. And a very good morning to all the participants here on the webinar, and a special thanks to SEC for organizing this. So very quickly, what we are going to cover in the next subsequent slides is three things. First, we will talk about some of the commercial aspects of power generation using crop residue, which is talking about potential in different member states, some of the financial parameters, payback period, etc. In the second part of the presentation, we will look at key challenges across different countries and across the value chain of of power generation using crop residue. And finally, we will end with country-specific recommendations, although we'll just look at the highlight points there so as to save more time. And then we'll follow it up with a Q&A session. So this is the flow that we will adopt for today's presentation. Moving on, so this slide tells us, basically indicates what is the overall power generation potential across the member nations. Although surplus residue potential using all crops grown in SAARC region is a great opportunity for power generation, most crops such as vegetable, oil seeds, pulses, cotton, etc., they produce residue which is not suitable for energy generation. These crops also have, varying harvesting periods and are not available in large quantities for efficient and economic collection of residues. However, these residue, the other alternate use is that residue from these crops can be used to feed cattle or can be used as manure. And in fact, it is extensively done so in the subcontinental region.
You are not audible. Mr. Sandeep, can you hear me?
Hello, 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 hello.
Mr. Sandeep.
Hello.
Hello, Mr. Sandeep. Please carry on. We can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. So should I start from the beginning or the first part of the first the first passage people were able to hear?
Yeah, you can start with the first passage.
Okay. So this particular slide, thank you. So this particular slide shows us the overall power potential across SAARC member nations. We are in total, from a highest of about 5,000 megawatt potential in India to let's say about 71 megawatts in Sri Lanka or 58 in Afghanistan. So these are quite varying across different SAARC countries. We have tried to map it across the countries. Although the surplus residue potential using all crops which are available in SAARC region provides a good opportunity for power generation. Many of these crops, such as cotton, oil seeds, and pulses, etc., they produce residue which is not suitable for power generation. And plus, at times they are not available in either economic or efficient quantities. Their periods of harvesting can vary. So they are not too much ideal from a commercial point of view to be used for power generation. So the alternate uses many times they are used as manure or cattle feed in the SAARC countries. It's observed that most crop residue burning in SAARC member states is a practice for basically rice stubble, and it's during the months of October, November for timely sowing of the wheat crop. And usually there is a 2 to 3 weeks window. The pattern is repeated when wheat stubble is burnt in the fields in the month of May and June. And burning of these two crop residues are one of the major contributors of excessive, particulate matter emissions and air pollution, along with smog in the winter. And we have all, I think most of us who have ever visited or looked at Delhi could understand how big a problem this is. Since the field-based residue like straw, stalk, wheat leaves are major elements prone to burning, only these have been considered for estimating the energy potential in SAARC member nations. Now, the way that we have, just to give everybody a little better understanding, the way that we have calculated the total energy generation potential is basically we looked at what is the surplus crop residue along with its collection efficiency and the conversion ratio to basically power potential. So that's how we have. So for example, when we talk about conversion potential, we looked at how much biomass is required for a specific crop residue to produce 1 megawatt of electricity. And we have used different collection efficiencies depending on different countries because it's depending on demographics and ease of collection, it can vary. Now, the total energy potential using rice and wheat paste residues alone is around 7.6 gigawatts. And only straw as husk is already being used in many areas for energy generation already. The highest energy potential is seen in countries with larger areas and subsequently large production of these crops and their residue. India, for example, has about 5.3 gigawatt potential, followed by Bangladesh, which has over 1 gigawatt, and Pakistan, which has close to 1 gigawatt potential. Power generation potential in Maldives and Bhutan is something that we have excluded from the study, partly because there is only a limited number of crops which are grown, and by the virtue of that, the potential is negligible. And so for that purpose, we have neglected it. And also because specifically in these countries, the geographical landscape is also tough in terms of which can encourage large scale collection and aggregation of residue. So to that extent, we have neglected it from our study. Moving on to the next slide. Yeah. So we just, in this particular slide, we're just talking about what are the common business models in energy generation. So once we have established the energy generation potential and to look at the business model for a successful supply chain from collection of residue to distribution of power to end users. And the most common business model comprises of 5 key stakeholders. We have the farmers, the aggregators, the power plant developer, the distribution companies, and the respective government. And all these 5 bodies have a key role to play in the overall supply chain. The farmers harvest their crop, store their residue, at their sheds or farms or farms. And aggregators are the one who are basically collecting these residues and provide it to generators. And aggregators typically come from an unorganized sector. And because the supply chain is so tough, aggregators play a prominent role in negotiating with farmers, in ensuring that the supply to the power plant is on a consistent basis. The aggregators then take this residue from the collection terminals and basically residue to the collection terminals of the power plant, where the residue is then processed into desired form for gasifier plants, and basically in form of either pellets or briquettes or bales, as we discussed in the earlier sections by Abhijit. The residue is then stored, under controlled temperature, because these are very, this is very sensitive to environmental conditions. And the power plant developers, they can choose on overall storage time, because there is a first substantial cost which is associated with storage. Many a times we see that generators often tend to only generate partial time during the year because the cost of storage and the challenge of storage is substantially high. So for that purpose, you will see that many gas-based plants, etc., only generate for half a year because they have continuous supply, and they would rather do it during the supply season rather than storing and continuing for the full round the year supply. So once delivered to the plant, the residue is basically fired in gasifiers to create energy in form of electricity, heat, or biofuels, and then the power is basically sold to the distribution companies for sale to grid or off-grid, rural households. Biofuels are of course sold to oil or transport companies. In some countries, for example, in India, we also have a mandatory biofuel mix which is allowed. So this provides some opportunity as well. And in all this program, government plays a key stakeholder, and that's what while responding to the earlier question I was mentioning, that we have to take cognizance that in today's context, this is not the most economical way of power generation. If we look at pure from a dollar to dollar perspective. But if we consider the benefits it has on the environment, on the country, on the health, then this is an avenue which needs to be promoted. And the promotion actually can happen only when government is involved as a stakeholder. So this is the general, supply chain and the business model under which power generation actually happens. Next slide. So here we're going to talk about, or we've tried to showcase a small case study. By implementing the above business model, we have, taken an example of setting up a biomass gasifier in Punjab in India. And it's a very high, high on agriculture scale, Punjab, with high production of rice, wheat, and sugarcane in the country. Punjab is very heavily dependent on rice and wheat cropping system. So, and basically it produces huge quantity of crop, which is crop residue, which then needs to be disposed of. And the rice stubble is generally burnt in the fields in the months of October to November. And we have seen that impact actually going that impact of burning of stubble, which has in cities such as Delhi, etc. So this pattern is often again then repeated for wheat stubble back in the month of April and May. Now for this particular assessment, what we have taken is we have taken rice and wheat production for 2018-19 in all the districts of Punjab as a state. Now based on these gross and surplus residue potential of rice and wheat, and we have looked at a collection efficiency of 75% of the surplus potential, and this is on a very conservative scale, of course. The total power potential is about 900 megawatts using just these two crop residues alone. The gross residue potential essentially, and that's what we are calling as, just to mention the definition of gross residue potential, it's basically the total amount of residue produced after harvesting a crop, while the surplus residue potential is basically residue left after completing uses. So that's just the difference I wanted to state. So if you look at the total power generation potential, as I was mentioning for Punjab, is about 933 megawatts, of which about 570 to 600 megawatts can be generated by using rice straw residues, while about 350 360 can be done from wheat straw residues. However, considering that that these two crops have complementary harvesting period, they don't have parallel harvesting. Actually, we can size plants which have overlapping periods of harvest. So rather than having combined 933 megawatts, we can actually have better utilization if we can plan a 570 or 573 kind of capacity. That would operate both across the year. It would give us the best utilization. So this is the case study that we have for state of Punjab. Can we move on to the next? Okay. Technology selection. Now, biomass gasification technology has been chosen for power generation owing to its ability to work with a large number of residue type, size, and wide operational range that can be scaled up from smaller quantities at maybe a village or a community level to large at a regional or a state level. Collection centers. So based on geographical distribution of rice production, it is recommended to set up multiple collection points, especially across different districts. Now, collection centers should have a capacity to store anywhere between 5 to 10,000 tons of rice per wheat, rice husk or wheat residue. It's also very important that the collection centers are close to the farms to minimize cost of transportation. Typically, we say that it should be within a 20-kilometer range. Cost of residue. The cost of residue, of course, it depends on the source of purchase and the overall transportation cost, etc. Straw-based residue can be procured, of course, directly from farmers using local aggregators, and wheat husks can be collected from. Rice husks can be collected from rice mills. In fact, the cost of procuring from farmers and mills is in the range of 43 to 57 tons However, this model we have looked at, we have considered a collection or an average price of about $54 million ton, which is determined as per the regulator in India by CRC. Size of the plant for an economic viability biomass gasifier below 10 megawatts is generally not very economically sustainable. Beyond this capacity, the logistics of handling residue again becomes very difficult because setting up a plant of higher capacity is not a problem, but sustaining it with continuous flow of residue that often becomes challenging, especially in subcontinent context where we don't have a very well-established logistics chain. So it's generally recommended to have a biomass gasifier which is in range of 10 megawatts odd, and generally it can be more distributed across different states or the country as a whole. So that would give that would make ease of operations as well as it will balance out commercial quite efficiently. So that's the kind of economical size that we can talk about. Next. Yeah. Continuing with the case study, power generated from power plants can be sold to consumers by connecting to the grid, of course. With 100% now household electrification, which is achieved in Punjab, even the rural households have electricity connection. And pardon me. And this could add substantial. This could actually help to meet substantial demand within the state. Decentralized biomass gasifiers can provide a solution for meeting the rising energy demand even at the domestic categories. Capital cost, if you look at the capital cost, is in the range of about 846,970 US dollars per megawatt, which is as per the guidelines by CRC. And often the way that CRC, what we have seen as a general trend is that companies or investors are able to achieve project cost, which is often better than what the regulator says. So to that extent, we think that actual cost will be slightly lower than that. A capital subsidy, of course, is provided for a little in excess of 200,000 US dollars per megawatt in case of India by MNRE, which reduces the overall capital installation cost to a little excess of 600,000 per megawatt, which in Indian terms would be roughly just in excess of about 4.5 crores a megawatt. Financial assumptions, we have considered a debt equity ratio of 70-30, which is as per the industry standard, also mandated by the regulator. The cost of funds is about 10.5%, which is in line with most of the NBFC rates, and we have considered a discounting factor of 10%. On the fuel side, as mentioned, we have considered a cost of fuel of $33 per ton with an escalation of 1.5%. O&M cost, we have considered an O&M cost of $70,000 per megawatt with an escalation of 3% over the useful life. Now, with these assumptions, for the case study that we have built for the state of Punjab, the equity break-even period for a single gasifier project without capital subsidy is around 7 years. The period can be reduced by 3 years with a 25% capital subsidy. So it is the payback period is 3 years if there is government support. Otherwise, it is 7 years. The most critical element for determination of tariff is the biomass procurement cost, and this cost can be reduced substantially if we can have a mechanism for fuel procurement annually. Now, today the challenge is that if we look at supply chains across, nations within SAARC, these supply chains are less formalized. So essentially, it's the regional or localized aggregators who are driving the market. And here again, government can play a very proactive role in establishing a mechanism where offtake of these residues from farmer or farmer associations can be made as a part of a larger government program. And if this part of the logistics can be solved, because this is the biggest hurdle for crop residue based power generating asset, if this part can be resolved by a more formalized approach by government, then it can become a much viable technology or the sector as a whole. Next. No, the one before. Achha, all right. So, so given what I spoke about in terms of biomass gasifier plant in Punjab, it can actually be modeled for other states as well. And as I also mentioned that from a perspective of the size of the power plant, we propose not just one asset, but we propose more like a decentralized cluster scheme. So look at 20-kilometer radius, and you could have a tail end plant at each of these 20-kilometer radius. So I think that works from an economic perspective and also from a risk perspective. That works best for everyone. Moving on to the barriers and challenges, and what we have tried to do. What we have tried to do is break up the challenges into 4 different parts. First is institutional and organizational, technical and implementation, financial, and then market factors. So we'll start with institutional and organization. While all SAARC nations have an apex body for formulation and administration of rules and laws pertaining to agriculture, but only India is actually among the SAARC nations have actually formulated a national policy for management of crop residue in the year 2014. Now, this policy basically it promotes technologies for optimization of for utilization and in situ management of crop residue, also using technologies such as satellite-based remote sensing technology to monitor these crop residue burning and promote more appropriate measures of on farming practices. Actually, in 2017, Government of India also mandated its largest thermal company, NTPC, which is a state-owned company, to blend 10% of crop residue with coal to reduce, overall agriculture burning. And under this program, NTPC will buy crop from the farmers, use it to make biomass pellets, and co-fire it with coal across its different plants in India. And in total, if you know that of the 175 gigawatt program which India has established, 10 gigawatt is basically assumed to come from biomass power. And since the announcement, which was back in December 16, actually we have added about 1.4 gigawatts by last year. Technology challenges. So, from a technology perspective, the technology for agriculture, waste-based power generation, to be honest, it is not fully standardized. We don't have a lot of documentation or validation at a commercial usage in SAARC countries specifically. Only a handful of projects are implemented in Pakistan and in India. The other big challenge within technology is scaling up. So if you see biomass technology, although it's mature and implemented in smaller scale, we still face substantial challenges in deploying it at a larger scale, and specifically because of what I was earlier just talking about in terms of sourcing problem across the year. Third is technology know-how and awareness. Now, information on, again, as I mentioned, on viable technology configuration and projects is very limited. So as such, typically the farmers are quite less aware of it. So to ensure that our supply chain improves, it is very important that communication is also made to farmers on the hazards of burning, and rather utilizing it for power generation can help the nation as a whole. Pre-treatment and storage. In most cases, residue requires pre-treatment, like baling or pelletizing or briquetting before reaching the power plant. These tools and machineries are again not quite freely available in rural areas. Lack of utilized mechanized harvesting techniques. So combined harvester, happy seeder, and super SMS are very expensive technology, and especially in the subcontinent, you won't find many farmers who would be using these technologies. So they would rather burn their residue, which is a more cheaper way of disposing rather than using expensive technology. Ash and char utilization. So gasification of crop residue can, while it produces electricity, it also produces certain harmful byproducts such as tar, ash, and char. Now, tar does not value add, to any of the processes or people, and hence must be cleaned off to maintain smooth operations of the asset. Ash and char, on the other hand, can find some applications such as in brick or cement industry, or it can be also used as a fuel or soil enhancer. So to that extent, we should not only look at having or setting up these power generation facility, but also at utilizing the waste products, the waste byproducts. So moving on to financial challenges, and basically there are four challenges: high installation cost, limited access to funds, government grants, and incentives and subsidies which can be followed up. So high installation cost, as I described previously, if you look at the total installation cost for the capacity exceeds substantially for comparable other renewable technologies which you can find. Sorry. Limited access to funds. Biomass-based energy projects are generally limited on a very small scale. The farmers are generally cooperative, so we actually need large private investors with substantial access to capital to come and get involved in this sector. But those guys will only get involved if we can make the sector less risky, and if we can make the sector more financially attractive. And to that extent, government grants and incentives and subsidies can play a prominent role in that. And finally, moving on to market factors. So essentially, transportation cost, as I was describing, transportation and logistics is the single biggest bottleneck for crop residue-based power generation facilities. Supply chain and lack of aggregators in many parts of the country is a big challenge. And often these aggregators or middlemen are unreliable. They either delay payments to the farmers, because of which farmers will often not sell their residue to these aggregators in the future, and inherently it affects the power generating plant or the investor who has put up crores to set up a facility, but just because the middleman is not honest enough, so both the end parties, the farmers as well as the investor, can suffer. So that's the reason why government can play a very proactive role in removing this middleman and making the sourcing and the supply chain aspect much more strong and transparent. Low market price for residue. So the other challenge is that there are alternate uses of some of the residues where the price that is offered by competitive industries could be higher, and to that extent we have to ensure that residue prices are maintained at certain levels, which not only benefits the industry but also benefits the farmers. It gives them an assured income for this. The other big challenge is also the lack of seasonal labor. So this is again, farmers face huge challenges, specifically in peak harvesting season, especially the smaller farmers. So larger farmers, of course, can afford them, but smaller farmers are generally unable to afford. So for them, what happens is that the harvesting window then shrinks substantially, and they would rather hire local help very quickly to dispose of, and rather than spending time on aggregation, etc., they would just like to burn it. So that's a much more easier way and cheaper way for them to dispose of, which means that at some manner government has to play a more proactive role in promoting this. Next. The next section we will talk about country-wise implementation plan. What we have done is we have developed a country-wise implementation plan for each member state. For at least for Bhutan and Maldives, I would have to mention that we have not included because the potential of energy generation is quite low, because the crop residue availability is quite low in the country. The table, as you see, gives a countrywide potential for power generation using agriculture residues. However, most countries with wheat rice to wheat pattern of cultivation, the power plant size can be optimized to operate on rice stalks and then straws after the end of the Kharif season, while on wheat stalks and straws at the end of Rabi season. So this will actually can help in reducing the power plant capacities by about 30 to 40%, which will mean that the overall utilization goes up while the capital cost comes down, and it can make the over economies of scale quite substantial. It also reduces land requirement, fuel storage requirements, etc. So thus a little bit of planning is also required to make it a little more viable. Implementation plan again has been tailor-made for each country based on the kind of crops that you have, the crops that are cultivated, the geographical location, and the distribution of these crops, such that collection can be optimized. And thereafter, plant sizes have been optimized to work on rice straw for half of the year, and then wheat straw for the other half of the year, wherever possible, of course, to reduce the overall capital cost, land requirement for plant and installation and fuel storage areas. Okay, so quickly moving on to Bangladesh. So in Bangladesh, sorry, yeah. So in Bangladesh, rice and wheat contribute about 47% of the overall agriculture production. So according to our estimation, we are looking at a surplus residue potential of about 15.6 million tons, with a residue collection efficiency of 75%. And this puts the overall generation potential to 1.1 gigawatts. And what we've tried to do is that across the the 4 locations, northeast, west, south, we have tried to segregate and find out what are the potential capacities, and of which we will see that barring south, the other 3 locations have on an average about 300 megawatts potential in each, and which will entail a total capex commitment of anywhere between 200 to 300 million dollars on the location basis. So this is overall Bangladesh program. If we look at next, in India, if you look at rice and wheat contribute to about 30% of our total food crop production. The total surplus residue potential that we have is about 80.3 million tons, and 75%, assuming 75% collection efficiency, we are looking at a power generation potential of about excess of 5 gigawatts, of which you would see that specifically north and east, which are heavily agriculture heavy, where we have heavy agriculture production. So north specifically on wheat, high on wheat, and east specifically high on rice. We would see the potential is in excess of about 1.2 gigawatts each. The overall capital requirement, capital investment, if you see in the sector, it's close to about $3 billion. Next. If you look at Nepal, total surplus residue potential is about 3 million tons. The residue collection efficiency in Nepal, although we believe will be slightly lower because of the challenges in aggregating this in the country, and hence we are looking at a total generation potential of 140 megawatts. And again, if we look at the spread, it is actually quite uniformly spread in case of Nepal, and we are looking at close around about $20 million investment in all the 4 regions. Next. Pakistan, we are looking at a total surplus residue potential of 13 million tons. With a 75% collection efficiency, we are looking at a power generation potential of 834 megawatts. Again, if you look at from a potential perspective, it is quite evenly spread across the 4 regions. And we expect on an average, each region will require in excess of $100 million across each region. So in cumulative, we would require close to $400 to $500 million to utilize full potential. Next. And finally, we look at Sri Lanka. The overall surplus residue potential is just 1 million tons. And rice production actually accounts for almost 90% of the capacities in the country. we are looking at overall power generation potential of just 70 megawatts. And this in turn, will require something around about 60 million US dollars for implementing overall 71 megawatt of plants. Again, if you look at, it's the eastern part of the country, which has a slightly higher in terms of, because it's higher on rice production, so it has slightly higher potential than compared to other parts of the country. So this is broadly the implementation plan that we have devised for all the countries. We will. So I'm not spending too much time on individual countries, and we will very quickly move on to the slide above. Yeah. Now, I just, I'm not spending too much time. This is more of a summary slide, but what I would like to mention is that there are other residues which are generated from harvesting and processing. Processing of rice and wheat crops, such as husks and shells. Now, these residues are available in rice and wheat meals and are already being used for power generation and allied purposes. And there are regulatory channels which are established. If this husk is also considered for revenue generation, if this husk is also considered for power generation purposes, then the overall potential will increase. So that's the only point which I wanted to make here. Next. Yeah. So, depending on the country's legislature, central governments of these countries must formulate suitable laws, policies, and orders for prevention of crop residue burning. Accordingly, central governments should identify and establish a regulatory body which should be independent to formulate policies and to ensure that implementations of offshore orders and policies and prevent or in fact ban the practice of crop residue burning. That is very, very essential. But it's also essential because it's very easy to ban something, but it's easy to provide an alternate source specifically to farmers who are poor or who cannot afford large scale aggregation, to provide them an alternate mechanism or a government mechanism which can enable them to basically not burn but supply their residue through these formal channels. And the regulatory bodies may also set up specific regional or district or provincial based cell, because the challenge is that unlike other forms of power generation where you can make policies at a central level, for this kind of generation where it is much more demographic and regional specific, we should have, if not regional cells, at least a mechanism to monitor at a regional and at a regional level. So that's very important. And government should also incentivize projects which are aiming specifically to utilize crop residue burning, so that they are made profitable. Because once these projects are made profitable, we will see large commercial investors investing. And once we see large commercial investors coming up, they will make substantial improvement in economies of scale, in overall prices, costing, etc., in ironing out supply chain issues. And because of that, the overall ecosystem will benefit. Costs will come down, tariffs will come down, and government in turn can realize a lot more benefit out of it. So it's crucial to look at the bankability of these projects and to enable some of the larger investors to enter the space. From a regulatory perspective, the lack of what we have generally seen is that there is a lack of support by electricity boards in promoting biomass power generation projects. Especially, they feel that this power generation is at higher cost and it often forms a burden for power utilities. However, if you look at the overall quantum of capacities which we are talking about, this is minuscule in compared to the overall procurement of a power distribution across SAARC countries. So what we suggest is that utilities can actually do a direct procurement of power, a certain percentage of power from biomass plant, and that could actually enable for a lot of investors to set up fresh capacities. Also, power generators who are setting up these capacities, they can be allowed. There could be a mandatory or a must-run status, which can be given to them. And if we do this, there will be two benefits. One is that we can find that this kind of generation facility can actually replace some of the other conventional facilities, such as oil, gas, or coal. And it will also encourage farmers to aggregate their farm waste instead of burning them. So it is actually a win-win monetary philosophy for everyone. Next. Yeah, we also propose that it's wise to establish regional monitoring cell, and that's what I was talking about previously, in each country to identify various interventions, formulate a work plan, and monitor its implementation at the ground level, at each region level, rather than sitting in capitals and formulating policies without having ideas on ground. So that's not something which is recommendable. At national level, the APEX monitoring or regulatory cell should monitor the overall, residue burning at regular intervals, and it is efficient to use technologies to do that after each harvesting station, specifically in target areas, to ensure that these laws are getting implemented. And as I was mentioning, that we should use better technology, which can help to reduce our overall monitoring cost as well, such as satellite-based monitoring. Next. Okay, very quickly, uh, government financial support for plant and equipment. It can be provided in form of either viability gap funding or FIT support. Second is access to funds. Today, financial institutions or commercial banks are reluctant to provide loans to bioenergy projects because the investment risks are high and there is no guarantee of repayments. So if we are able to create a mechanism through which we make these projects bankable, such as government support and procurement, etc., other industries, other large commercial investors will begin investment. Today, if you look at in India, most of the projects are financed by IREDA or IDBI or ICICI as well does some bit of funding. But it's essential that we make these projects bankable so that larger financial community can invest. I think this is one of the space where multilaterals can play a predominant role because it entails, it covers a lot of environmental areas. I think multilateral agencies such as World Bank, the Fed, etc., can play a prominent role in this. The third element is SARC Development Fund. I think there is an operational SARC Development Fund. Now, if member states agree on joint investment into specific bioenergy projects or technologies, and if they could do a more free sharing of technologies and provide support to each other for faster adoption, this can actually benefit everyone. And this association could actually drive, a lot of benefits to the participating nations. We could harness benefits of having centralized manufacturing facilities of boilers, reactors, etc., which can drive down overall cost of implementation or cost of components, because right now most of these equipment are either manufactured suboptimally or they are basically bought out from international markets. So we could look at joint investment into manufacturing capacity as well. We could look at leveraging capital flow from each other's countries. So wherever, for example, if any country doesn't have a large capital market, we should allow capital flow from other countries and investors from other countries to go and invest. That will ensure that these capacities come up. And I think where the SARC fund can play a predominant role is having a small pool of funding R&D efforts, specifically to come up with technologies that suits our environment, our ambient condition. Because the other challenge which often in technology we find is that we tend to buy out technologies from international markets, which is suited for international markets. It is quite essential that we have technologies in-house which is suited for our own ambient conditions. And finally, we should allow complete access to each other's technical capabilities, be it manpower, be it technology, or be it capital. Next. Okay, so here we're going to talk about some of the more technical and implementation related suggestions. So the first one is infrastructure assessment. I think each member nations, the government should assist in implementation of bioenergy projects by ensuring enough information is available for study. A detailed resource assessment for different crops and regions, along with their quantum of production and timeline of availability, should be conducted by nodal agriculture agencies of different countries. And this information will actually help developers, investors, and researchers to plan better for each region. In addition to that, electricity demand estimation in certain region should be used to locate tail end users of energy generated, and this can actually help in planning decentralized generation capacities quite a bit. Second, we should have awareness campaigns, because to be honest, most farmers may not be aware of crop residue management techniques and the benefits overall on social, environmental, and also for monetary purposes. So it is important that this initiative is taken to educate them on efficient residue management. Third is skill development. I think extremely crucial that along with awareness campaign, skill development programs are organized to train people across, to train people with necessary expertise to operate machinery for harvesting, for sowing, for setting up, and for operating biomass power plants, because this is also an avenue for employment generation. You see, so as I said, I mean, this biomass plants can have an overall. It should be looked at from a system perspective rather than just a project perspective. And at system level, it also provides certain benefits such as employment generation as well. And finally, equipment and machinery. Most farmers in SARC are more used to traditional methods of farming because they don't have access to modern sowing, harvesting equipment and machinery. The government should, and this is a place where government only can play a role, where to promote more modern technologies to enable faster and more efficient harvesting by promoting, and they can give capital subsidy for purchase of this equipment, etc. Or more concessional financing program, some of these other mechanisms. And at the end, it's government should actually prioritize these technologies which are eligible for subsidy for farmers, so that farmers are also more encouraged to buy more efficient technology. And finally, to the last, next one. And finally, the last set of recommendations that we have on specific market factors, aggregating terminals. This is one of the most important bit in the overall logistics supply chain, because today the biggest hurdle which are faced by farmers in supplying crop residue is the lack of transportation facility. So it is recommended to set up regional level collection centers that can easily be accessible by farmers using, there are, I mean, in most cases, you'll find farmers using bullock carts or small tempos or small tractors. So it should be easily accessible using those modes of transport. And we should ensure that there is maximum participation by farmers who do not have to travel, large distances, because it should not become a pain for them. And also this, these terminals should act as, also have substantial storage to store these raw materials which are being sent by farmers for the power plants. Price realization. It is recommended that regulatory body aids in discovering a fixed price for different types of residue depending on harvesting season and region. The prices can then be displayed, using a website or on phone apps, etc., or at some kind of portal, which can reduce instances of any sort of cheating or any such kind of not so good behavior by aggregators. So, for example, in India, CRC has discovers fuel procurement costs for different kinds of residues for each states, and this this information is often available at publicly in tariff regulations. The other big challenge, and other countries can also follow a similar principle. It is also observed that many discoms they don't schedule biomass power because its variable cost is very high. In such cases, developers are forced to then sell it under power exchange, or they don't sell at all. So, so this is this again completely disrupts the viability of plants. So it is ideal to give biomass a must-run status in lines with like we have for other renewable technologies or for plants such as nuclear plants, for example, etc. So these should be given a must-run status. And finally, we can have some incentive programs like a reward scheme, which can be designed for villages that don't burn crop residues. So these are financial tips and bits that we can do to basically attract at village level more cooperation in terms of logistics supply. And finally, support service based, to set up shared infrastructure. The biggest challenge, and we should understand this, is that farmers face financial difficulty to purchase mechanized farming equipment, and these are extremely expensive for individual purchases. And the kind of capacity that most farmers across SAARC countries share is not ideal for even full utilization of this machinery. So government should promote setting up a mechanism and incentivizing shared buyout by a group of farmers or an association of farmers, so that A, they are able to share cost and the subsidy burden on government can come down, and B, also they are able to utilize the infrastructure, the common infrastructure for a better period of time. So by implementing some of these initiatives that we talked about, we can actually help the overall sector quite a bit. So with this, I would like to take a pause and would be happy to answer any questions subsequently. Sanjay, I'm unable to hear you. I don't know if you're audible to others or not.
Well, let me repeat again. Am I audible now?
Yes, sir, you're audible now.
That's great. Thank you. So let me thank you again for such a detailed and well-explained presentation. And obviously we have a lot of questions, but at the same time we are short of time as well. So I will try to be brief, and I'll also request you to be brief in your response. So our first question from Mr. Pradeep Kumar, whom we missed previously due to again the shortage of time. So his first question is that what are the assumptions in calculating surplus residue out of gross residue? Over to you, Sandeep.
Sure. Hello. Hello.
Yes, Pradeep. Sandeep, sorry.
Yeah. Am I audible now? No.
Yeah, it's clear. Sorry.
So basically, what we are seeing is from the gross residue. What we have considered is the total amount of residue that is produced after harvesting a crop. So that is what we are saying is the gross residue for a particular country. And surplus residue we have calculated based on gross residue minus any other usage, any other competing usage that we have in specific country, and this can vary from country to country. So for example, if you're let's say we are we have a gross residue of about 100 tons, then surplus residue is after deducting its competing usage, for example, usage in manure, usage in fodder. So we've deducted that from gross residue to calculate what is the surplus residue potential. And this again, what we have tried to do is we have tried to estimate this for different crops, because different crops will have could have different uh, competing usages as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I hope so. So we move to our next live question. We have Mr. Tularam Paudel with us. He has a question for you. Please, Mr. Tularam Paudel.
Am I audible, Yasan sir?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Yasan sir, and thank you, Sandeep, for your presentation. Maybe my question, maybe you already discussed in your recommendation, but I want to particularly ask you what particular incentives you can offer to farmer to convince or motivate them for collection of the residue.
Yeah. So thank you, sir. Very pertinent question. I think one is, if you look at farmers' problems, right? So they have a couple of problems in this. One is that it is expensive for them to use this route. So the first effort is that, can government or other agencies make an effort to reduce this cost for them? Which means that first of all, can they create a more transparent mechanism of collection to supply to the power generation facility, which could entail, for example, transparent notification of transfer prices, having government notified or approved aggregators in a particular state. Because today, if you look at the challenge is that aggregators are actually non-organized. These are middlemen in many places, and quite often whenever you talk to a farmer, etc., you'll find that aggregators basically they do arbitrage. They will at times delay payment. They will not pay, etc. So anything we can do to improve this entire supply chain, be it direct payment into their bank accounts, for example. If there's a government approved channel here, and then the payments could be directly made to the bank account of farmers, or it could be at least they have more surety that money will come to them. And when somebody sees monetary benefit, it will always work. The second thing what we are saying is that look at the logistics of the, I mean, let's also appreciate that when we are looking at rural parts of our SAARC countries, right, these are not places where connectivity, etc., is so easily available. So we have to make sure that logistics are not made in such a way that it becomes pain for farmers. So essentially, if you remember, and that's the reason why we are saying that look at a radius of 20 kilometers and not more than that, because using the village transport, it is going to be extremely difficult. And third is that so these are hard incentive measures. Then there are softer incentive measures. For example, what what we call as nudge economics, right? So nudge economics is somewhere where governments actually nudge people that be more socially responsible. Just to give you an example, the way, for example, it happened as subsidy, giving up LPG subsidy in India, right? So government of India said that if you're a patriot, then give up LPG subsidy if you can afford it, right, and give it to a weaker section. And there are lakhs and lakhs of people who actually went ahead with it, even though that meant that they have to pay some extra money. So at times it is not just about monetary benefits; it's also about nudging people to do the right things. And this was very widely, this kind of nudge office, actually having a very dedicated nudge office to do environmentally better things, was started by Prime Minister David Cameron in UK. It was then adopted by Barack Obama, an Australian Prime Minister as well. So this is a very, very powerful thing, and we often tend to overlook the benefit of appealing to people's morality. So I think that's the other thing which can be done, along with things, for example, like awarding the best village every year, giving them a higher platform that they are most energy, they are most efficient, and they have never burnt any residue for this particular year. So some of these measures can play a very, very proactive role. Unlike other forms of energy, we have to do micro implementation when we are talking about this technology specifically.
Okay.
I hope it addresses some questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Sandeep. It's a well explained question. There is a similar question to that. It's from Mr. Rajesh. He wants that how the surplus residue factor has been decided based on primary survey or some secondary data.
It's actually both. We have used certain reports which where surveys were conducted, because in this particular study, of course, we didn't have a lot of scope to go to the field and do primary research. So we relied on mostly on secondary reports by some of the survey agencies. So many of these reports, for example, were done for regulatory purposes, and we had access to that. So that's something we utilized. In addition to that, we did some discussion with aggregators, etc., on a very aggregators and players on a very. I won't say it was a survey, but it was just as discussion with experts to validate what we have done, or the numbers that we are taking are in sync with the reality. So I would say secondary with validation by a few discussions or interviews.
I'll take one last question before moving to our next session. It's from Leela Krishna from India. The question is that how we can trace the untapped crop residue utilization in the country.
Pardon me, Asanji. I think there's some problem. I didn't get the first part of your question.
Okay, I'll repeat. How we can trace the untapped crop residue utilization in any country?
As I said, this is a very unorganized sector. So essentially, there are two ways of doing it. Either we can do a detailed survey, specifically region to region, and at times we have seen regulatory commissions or state governments doing this survey to estimate what is the unused potential. Or the second is that, from a thumb rule basis, you can do some broad estimations of it. But again, as I said, these estimations would only give you a wide range. Estimating based on overall potential, agriculture throughput, what is the residue generation potential that you're having, and then going out to the end use and looking at how many power plants or other usage are established in particular state or the country, and hence how much fuel they would be finally utilizing. So these are back-end calculations, can be done sitting in our room to an extent. But having said that, this was only good number for a report purposes. But if you're looking at implementation, we have to go down to survey level to estimate these factors at a much better detail to go for implementation. I hope that answers the question.
I hope so as well. So with this, we end this session. Thank you very much, Sandeep. It was a really impressive and well-explained presentation. Thank you for your time and your expertise. So thank you for taking us to the energy generation potential from member states, the barriers and challenges for implementation and recommendations. So thank you, sir, again.
Thank you.
So now I would like to introduce our final presenter of today, Mr. Vinod Kumar Jain. He is a former advisor from the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy of India. Today he will be speaking on changes in handling and utilization of paddy straw for energy generation. Mr. Jain has more than 37 years of experience in design, implementation, and management of projects and programs relating to biomass, waste to energy, and rural energy access, etc. He has successfully implemented various projects funded by the World Bank, UNDP, and from like many other multilateral organizations related to biomass power and energy access. He has also worked in the area of biomass gasification in a research and development center. With this, I would like Mr. Jain to proceed with his presentation. Over to Mr. Jain.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Audible. So shall I start?
Sure, please.
Good afternoon, Dr. Swain, Mr. Hassan, and other officials of SET. Good afternoon to all the participants from the SARC region and PwC team. I have a very brief presentation describing the challenges in handling and utilization of paddy straw for energy generation. These slides are based on practical experience and not copy paste from anywhere. Government of India is implementing this program for last 25 years. And today the installed capacity from biomass is around 4,000 megawatt, and another 5,000 is from bagasse cogeneration in sugar mills. So in all, we have more than 9,000 megawatt installed capacity from biomass power against the total potential of 10 to 12,000 megawatt. Just 1 second. Yeah. Before coming to the actual presentation, I would like to show this slide. Can we really stop paddy burning in the field? My answer is no. Because it is the economics which drive or which force farmers to burn paddy straw in the field. You all may be knowing that the farmers get 30 to 40 days to remove the residues from the field to prepare the field for the next crop. Even if we use the mechanical harvesting, the height of the plant left in the field is 6 to 12 inches. Now uprooting this portion to clean the field, either one more tractor operation is required. Are you able to hear me? Hello? 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 Hello?
Yes, you are audible.
Yes, sir, Vijay, you are audible. You can move your slides. Yeah,
So
please carry on.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, you are clear.
Yeah. So, to uproot these remaining residues of the plant, either farmer has to do one more operation, and that require incurring more additional cost besides the issue related to time and the labor. So farmer has no option but to burn this the plantation in the field so that it can clear his field easily. Government of India has taken several initiatives like providing subsidized equipment for removing these crop residues as well as for the collection, cash incentive to the farmers as well as the education so that they are motivated not to burn this in the field. Next slide. Yeah. Now I'll be covering these three types of challenges which a project developer face. And all these challenges have been worked out considering the plant capacity of 10 megawatt based on that stuff. The first one is the fuel management, which is a confident task for a developer. Collection, transportation, storage, and the processing. Because one needs to ensure a sustained supply of biomass at a competitive price at plant site. Now, what are the challenges involved in the fuel management? On an average, 1 megawatt capacity power plant requires 22 to 25 metric tons of paddy scrap per day. For a 10 megawatt, it will be around 220 to 250 megawatt per day. The annual requirement for a 10 megawatt power plant will be around 75,000 megawatt per day. This means the developer has to collect or mobilize biomass from an catchment area of 15,000 hectares. Now, to mobilize that, what he has to do? He requires residue collection equipment. Once the plant is harvested, one can use the balers to make bales of the residue. At present, the baler capacity is to 10 to 12 tons per day. One baler, tractor-operated baler, can bale 10 to 12 tons of paddy stock per day. That means the number of balers required is 150 to 160 balers, and each baler costs around 12 to 15 lakhs. The total investment may be around 225 million rupees. In addition to this, he has to arrange equal number of tractors and other machines. Making this investment, developer is able to use only 30 to 45 days. The rest of the year, the machinery remains idle. So it becomes a dead investment for the remaining period. Again, is the transportation. The package has a very low density, 30 to 40 kg per meter square, and one trolley. Normal trolley can take a maximum of 2 tons per day. The farmers or the developers in Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan have modified the trolley to move more biomass, but the maximum capacity again is 4 to 5 tons per day. That means if we presume the 10 trips per day, the total movement of paddy stock will be 40 to 50 tons per day. This means minimum 50 trolley load is required every day for moving the required quantity of biomass. This means every 12 minutes, one trolley should reach to the plant site and get it unloaded also at the plant site. This becomes a very Herculean task as well as creating a lot of local pollution because of the diesel burning. Next is the storage. Again, the storage is a huge challenge because in a 40 days window, one has to store 75,000 metric tons of paddy stock. We are talking about exclusively based on paddy stock, plant based on paddy stock. So at the depot or at the plant site, it has to be staked scientifically so that the degradation in quality of paddy is less, because otherwise it is subjected to moisture and the environment. Second major issue is the fire results. The dry paddy straw self-combustion is very low, and it is prone to get fire. A lot of fire safety equipment has to be installed around the storage area. Next, processing of paddy straw. I'll tell you the properties of paddy straw in the next slide, but it's very flexible. It is very difficult to cut. And because of the silica content as well as the sand particles come along with the residue, the devices get broken very easily or very frequently. Now, as PwC suggested that one should go for the biomass gasification using the pellets. First thing is very difficult to pelletize paddy straw because of this physical and the chemical characteristics. It's not easy to pelletize paddy straw. Second thing is, as far as I know, the pelletizing machines, the capacity available in the Indian market or even abroad, ranges from 5 to 10 tons per day. This means one needs to install 20 to 25 repeating machines to meet the requirement. Again, managing 25 machines, 20 to 25 machines becomes another separate activity for the developer. If we plan to use in a boiler, then one has to derail this, remove the twine, and then do the chopping. Again, chopping has a cost issue because excessive blade wear and tear due to aggressive nature of the straw. Coming to the physical and the chemical characteristics, which are more important to select a technology. It's very flexible, it's difficult to cut or shred, it contains high silica content, so low life of cutting blade choppers. It degrades very fast because of in the open environment, so loss of calorific value, susceptible to self-combustion in the dry atmosphere. If we look at the chemical characteristics, the straw has high percentage of alkali and chloride. Ash is medium to high depending upon the variety of paddy. Comparatively high moisture compared to other biomass. It has 10%, about more than 10%, and the fixed carbon is also low, it's 15%. So, even in the same zone, the chemical composition of paddy straw will vary depending upon the soil condition and the chemical fertilizer used to grow the paddy. Now there are three options I have taken. I'm not considering that pyrolysis, co-firing, etc. These are the three main commercially available technologies. The gasification, combustion, and the biological conversion. In my view, paddy straw is not at all suitable for gasification, mainly the conventional downdraft and down the top. The reason being that very poor flow, even either raw straw or in the pellets inside the gasifier. It will form the hot pockets because of silica, leading to formation of clinker, slag, and high amount of formation of tar, which will give a very poor quality of producer gas, which may not be suitable to use in the ICE or the producer gas. The engines which are available, mainly the imported engines in the megawatt range, and some megawatt range, yes, Indian engines are also available, but they require the gas quality containing less than 200 milligrams per normal meter cube of tar, and less than the particulate matter, sorry, and maybe 50 milligrams per normal meter cube of tar. So that's kind. It will require a very elaborate gas cleaning and scrubbing system to get that kind of quality of producer gas to be fed into the engine, which is normally not practically not possible to achieve. At the same time, lot of effluent will get generated, so one has to keep it before it is disposed on the land or in the water bodies. Coming to the combustion technology, we have limited experience, but yes, we do have a plant, 12 megawatt capacity, exclusively based on paddy stock. We have more than 160 power plants ranging from 6 megawatt to 20 megawatt based on other biomass. In operating this paddy stock plant, we found a lot of corrosion in the boiler tubes and other parts, as well as the fielding issue, derailing, cutting, and other things, which require a lot of design changes in the existing boiler design, which our Indian company did it and succeeded to develop a full-proof or a better design to take care of the paddy stock properties. Now, the biological conversion. This is one of the emerging technologies, the development of pre-treatment processes to remove lignin from the paddy stock. And as in the ministry as well as the developers, see, this is the most commercially viable option to treat paddy straw in a decentralized manner. Maybe some 2 megawatt capacity equivalent to generating some 25,000 meter cube per day, and produce either the bio-CNG or the liquid fuel for the transportation purposes. Yeah. This is our experience. If you burn the paddy straw in the normal boiler, lot of corrosion and erosion take place and the boiler falls because of the chloride, sodium, potassium content in the raw material. Now, the second is the policy and the regulatory framework. At least in India, we have a very robust policy and the regulatory framework. We have even tariff for the biogas power, and we keep on revising based on the feedback from the field. We have exclusive tariff for power from paddy stock, and is applicable is the two states, Punjab and Haryana, are paying a high tariff for a plant based on paddy stock. As a part of the policy, we provide grant or subsidy. We help in allotting land on lease, tax holidays, and maybe the low cost debt, etc. On the regulatory front, yes, we give preferential tariff. But the key issue is that DISCOMs are not ready to buy. So why they should buy a costly power against a cheap green power from the solar energy? So even if government allows or government provides necessary incentive, it is a DISCOM to buy. They are not willing to. The second issue is the integration to the grid. DISCOM require a firm power, and which is probably not possible in the gasification system. They require firm power, firm scheduling of the power for the grid stability, which is not possible, at least in the gasification. Now, so what are the takeaways or the possible solution? You should select a system or the energy generating system based on multiple feedstock so that the dependency of the fatty stock can be reduced. Second thing, in my opinion, the combustion or the biological conversion routes are the only two options, and gasification probably may not work unless the technology, some new technology emerges and proven at scale. India we have a necessary conducive policy and the regulatory framework, but others are countries can use Indian experience to develop the similar framework. My last point is a detailed assessment of availability of fatty stock and other biomass is must before deciding the size and the capacity of the power plant. Like in the PwC report, the wheat straw has been suggested as one of the raw material for energy generation. As far as I know, wheat is grown only in the northern part of India, and it is the only feedstock for animals. Wheat straw is not at all available for energy generation. The second thing is the availability of biomass after considering the other competing uses. A detailed study is required to, to, to determine this surplus biomass available for other energy generation purposes. So I think that's all I'll say. If anyone has any question, I am ready to answer. How to
Thank you very much, Mr. Jain. It was very interesting presentation. Now we will move to our question answer session. We have Mr. Bhupendra Das from Nepal. He's shown keen interest in the subject. I think he has some relevant research in the same area. So over to you, Mr. Bhupendra Das, for your any question. Mr. Bhupendra, can you hear us?
But I'm not able to see you all.
Mr. Bhupendra, can you hear us? Yeah. So meanwhile, we are able to hear Mr. Bhupendra. I will go with another question. It's from Mr. Rajesh, who asked that what is the technology considered for power generation and at what efficiency?
Yeah. Which technology you are talking about?
I mean, he is generally asked question for which particular technology you recommend for power generation using these petty straw or other residues.
As I told you, the oil go for combustion or anaerobic digestion.
Right.
Because of the inherent problem in gasification technology. technology. We are running gasification program from the very beginning. We started with the small capacity, low watering gasification system based on wood or woody material for to meet the irrigation as well as the local electricity requirement. But we miserably we provide a lot of subsidy, almost 50% of the total cost, but we couldn't able to succeed because it requires lot of attention as well as the use maintenance, periodic maintenance of the system, plus other technical problems. And coming to a 10 megawatt power plant, so far we have experience to set up module of 1 megawatt. That means for the 10 megawatt power plant, you need 10 gasification systems of 1 megawatt each. And operation of the 10 units at a time will definitely be again an issue. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it's clear. Bhupendra?
Yes, can you hear me? Hello.
Yeah, no, it's clear. No, it's clear. So please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, so thank you, James, sir. It was such a nice presentation. And actually, I published a relevant paper. It was on a model dairy emission inventory for crop residue open burning in case of Nepal, in terms of Nepal. But what I recommended in that paper, like also like a bifurcated production, like energy generation solution really presented here. But because I am a environmental scholar, I would like to know everything in terms of your pollution. It's a very nice. It's very glad that yes, we can generate, or there are very good potential for energy generation from crop residue, not only rice or paddy. It's like it's from different crops. So we can, if we are able to collect it properly, and if we can use them in efficient manner, definitely there is very good potential for electricity generations, which might be very good for the countries which they don't have access to, like let's say hydropower. But the same time, in the same side, there are challenges as well, because like if we can't use properly, or if it's not like used efficiently, that there are high possibilities or risk of getting like a higher, let's say, air pollutants. For example, if it is not burned properly, then there is chances of emissions of carbon monoxide, like PM, black carbon. And you know that crop residue open burn in the field is not only a big challenge. If we are using that residue or densifying it, or let's say we are using in terms of energy, can we make sure that there are no any air pollutions, or let's say if air pollution is getting highly reduced? So how can you look in terms of like management approach? How can you sure or make sure that after consulting in the energy perspective that it is not going to be any like serious issues for climate change or regional warming or in terms of health? Because what I believe is that energy generation, like there are lots of potential other options, like let's say, for example, hydropower, solar energy, others, like wind energy. But being all those, still we are recommending that using crop residue in terms of like energy generation. So won't it be a big challenge? Like we are in the 21st century and climate change is a big issue for us. But I would also like to suggest, I understand that there is big potential of energy generation, but there are other potential as well. Let's say, for example, mushroom cultivations. Like it could be for like a different purpose, like using in the brick kiln. And there are lots of options. Like it can also be used for animal feed instead of using energy generations. So Because if we are going for those alternatives, definitely we are in the safe side that it's not going to emit like high pollutants. But if we are choosing energy generation path, definitely what I believe that we are not in the safe side for like lowering the pollutants. So what is your perception on this? I would like to know from your side. Thank you.
I have to respond.
Yes,
Yes,
sir. Yes, sir.
you can add. Yeah, please.
Yeah. What I could understand is that what Mr. Das is saying, that why we are opting for energy generation instead of other better uses, and what is the impact on local environment also. Yeah, am I right?
Yes, sir. Not only local environment, we have to think of health as well.
Then we can convert it into the global environment or whatever you feel like.
Yeah.
But local environment, we start with that. What you are suggesting, yes, whatever the local user, again you want to use local uses for mushroom cultivation, or maybe for paper industry, for the making compost. These are the local options, not the not the
पॉइंट आउट कर दिया यहाँ पे वो क्रीम
particularly
जा रहा है ठीक है क्योंकि बड़े ऊपर क्या ना
compost. That is one. The second thing, even if we go for the compost or the mushroom cultivation, it emits carbon dioxide, both the process. That means again you are adding to the your climate change concern. If we go for the combustion or the gasification, combustion slightly higher, particulate emissions and the flue gases. But already we have regulations to meet the emission requirements. And that's why I am for anaerobic digestion, where there is no emission at all. It's a very environmentally benign process. You get compost also, stabilized compost after extracting the biogas. And again, it's a decentralized, so one has to do less work on mobilizing the biomass. So I'll prefer either anaerobic digestion, and if it's not possible, then conversion. Not at all. Am I clear?
Yes, sir. I agree to most of your point, but in terms of, as you told, that CO2, because we know that it is a carbon neutral. If you like burn crop residue, definitely whatever the carbon dioxide is emitted, it is going back again. It is coming, like let's say it's carbon sequester, because it is coming back again, and that same crop is using CO2. So then I don't think there will be net CO2 left in the atmosphere. Sometimes it goes in minus. But like there are risks. But my concern was, but my concern was it is not only regarding like CO2. There are other different pollutants like CO, which can't be like can't be like cleaned easily. It's very risk, it's very difficult. There are lots of so many different pollutants. Even if we go for energy production process, like there are lots of pollutants still coming. So what I believe is that yes, there are very big challenge to manage those air pollutants. No matter what path we go, only there might be chances of like less or like let's say high, low or high. But what I believe there could be like a more focused on other alternative, which could be even better than this. What I believe personally, and also what I would like to add that if we really go for commercializations, I personally feel that it can be a disaster. Why? Because if farmers there, because we are sure that farmers are burning. Yeah, yes, to that to some point it's okay, but farmers could not burn as much as if we go for commercializations. That's the other aspects. So let's think about that as well. If we do more commercializations, it can go even, the emissions level can go even higher than what farmers they do, because everywhere farmers do not burn. Yes, to some parts, in some way, in some like specific, like let's say like the population is getting higher and higher. In that parts they could burn, but other parts it's not going to burn as we expect, you know. So it's like a hoax or something, let's say like a media rumor. So we have to think about that in a way. So better to say cheap technology or cheap method, or farmers can, it's better to deploy, or it's better to ask the farmers to use the residue themselves. Let's say raising livestock, using the most
Thank you,
cultivations so they
Gopinath.
can increase the crop generation.
Your point is well taken. Let me interrupt you because we are short of time. Your point is very valid, and agreeing your point, let me interfere. Actually, there is one reason behind why we are going for energy generation, because we as a SARC Energy Center, our scope is relevant to energy. We are not purely looking after the environmental aspect. But you are very much right that the ideal solution should be some agriculture solution. We are just giving an alternative to the farmers, to the governments, and to the policy makers. But yes, agriculture is the best solution. But instead of just you imagine that instead of burning this crop residue open in the air, why not to take some advantage, and then you can say release some gases in the air. So ultimately, at least we are having some financial commercial advantage at the part of the farmer, and at the same time we are in energy deficit region, so why not get benefit of that energy as well. So you are talking about ideal conditions. I do agree with you, but there are some a term we use as sustainable development. So it's in my view, it's a bit sustainable way that instead of straight away burning into open air, why not to give some commercial benefit to the farmer, and at the same time to have an energy benefit. So that's, I believe, we can move ahead to our next question. I'm really thankful to you for the very valid point, and yes, policy makers should consider your point, because ideally we would also like not to release any sort of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. So thank you very much. Wish you best of luck in your research. Thank you very much again, Bipendra, for your time and your involvement.
Thank you
So
so much.
we'll move. We'll take one more question. It is from Mr. Yash Khanna. He is also asking about the efficiency improvement to cost trade-off between conventional draft-based gasifiers and more advanced fluidized bed and entailed gasifiers. So, Mr. Vicky Jain, would you be able to put some light on this question?
Overall efficiency remains in 20 to 30%. If we say the efficiency of the overall system, that is the gasification, cleaning, and then utilization of gas in a unit. And it depends on the technology we select. It may be less in downdraft gasifier. Updraft definitely are not suitable for producing gas, quality gas to be fed into IC engine. Fluidized gas, yes, efficiency may be higher, but it's still, I think that technology is still in the development of this way. But if we one go for an imported Gen Becker engine, G engine, yeah, efficiency can go up to 38%. But then again, one need to see the economic viability of the whole system. Is that answer?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Vicky Jain. Your presentations were really very interesting, and I really thank you very much for your time and your expertise and your knowledge and your contribution toward the study report. Thank you very much, sir. So with this, thank you very much. So, dear participants, after listening to experts, it can be easily assessed that this is such a vast topic that need lot of effort to work on. At this point of time, what can be expected based on the discussion and obviously the conclusion drawn by our authors is that number one, crop residue burning is one of the biggest contributors that air pollution has gone up to catastrophic levels in many large cities in the region. This demands exploration of alternative uses of crop residue. Traditionally, very small amount of this residue is being used as cattle fodder, cooking fuel, animal bedding, and paper production. Well, energy generation using crop residue can be a sustainable option for effective residue utilization in the SAARC member states. Based on the estimated 115 million ton surplus crop residue production annually, there is a potential of installing 7,598 megawatt biomass-based power plants. The sustainable operation of a biomass power plant are largely dependent on the cost of biomass, capital investment, and operation and maintenance costs. In doing so, we have to overcome various barriers such as lack of awareness among farmers, difficulties in collecting and storing of crop residue, and public sector support. With this, we move towards the end of the session. I would like to request Honorable Deputy Director, SAARC Energy Center, to give the concluding remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ihsan. Thanks. Well, dear participants, let me begin by thanking the presenters of this video conference, Mr. Sandeep Kumar Mohante and his team from PricewaterhouseCoopers of India for taking us through the very informative details of this study report and their excellent replies to the queries raised by the participants. I am also thankful to my dear friend Mr. V.K. Jain for his contribution in the report as a peer review and sharing his vast and invaluable experience on this important subject. During this video conference, we came across interesting and useful information through the presentations and experiences. I believe that sharing of such information has resulted in many good lessons for all of us and has improved our understanding of the important environmental problem. I would like to pay my deep respect to all the participants for their enthusiasm and active participation in this video conference. I hope that the learning of this video conference will help all of us in our areas of responsibilities and will lead to further strengthening of the regional energy sector. Furthermore, I would like to inform you that SAARC Energy Center is also organizing more of such activities on various other energy-related topics. Next in line, we have a video conference on promotion of net metering in the SAARC member states, which is scheduled on 8th September. I request you all to join us on this very interesting technical topic as well. Your feedback and recommendations for further improvement of the research reports would be highly appreciated. Finally, I would like to thank my own staff for organizing this event and ensuring its smooth conduct. I thank you all once again for your participation and wish you all a safe stay during these times of pandemic. In the end, I would like to announce the formal closing of the video conference and wish a better environment for all South Asian people and future generations. Thank you for your attention. May God bless all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's video conference. All presentations will be available on SAARC Energy Center's websites very shortly. We would love to hear from you for any suggestions or comments for further improvement, plus any suggested topic of your interest on which you want us to arrange future video conferences or webinars. We would gladly do that. We also update our programs and activities on social media like Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, through which you can reach us. With me signing out, thank you again for joining us today and looking forward to see you next time. Bye-bye.